the previous segment, we discussed the religious and spiritual world of our ancestors. In this segment, we will try to say something about politics and warfare tens of thousands of years ago. Again, we cannot say as much as we would like because there is little firm evidence to support our theories. As we discussed at the beginning of these lessons, scholars cannot even agree on the most basic stuff, such as whether people had private property, whether they had nuclear families and monogamous relationships. But from time to time, archaeologists do come across some rich finding that can shed some more light on the world of the Stone Age. One of the most remarkable findings of the last few decades was made at Sungir. That's a place in Russia. There, Russian archaeologists have uncovered a 30,000 years old burial site belonging to a culture, to a society of mammoth hunters, a society which subsisted mainly by hunting mammoth and other large animals in the Arctic. In one grave in this burial site, they discovered the skeleton of a 50-year-old man, which was covered in the grave with strings of ivory beads, beads made from the ivory of mammoth, this kind of very big elephant. Altogether, the grave contained about 3,000 such ivory beads. On the head of the dead man, there was a hat decorated with the teeth of fox. On his hand, he wore 25 ivory bracelets. This is also something they found in the grave. Other graves from the same site contained also skeletons of people, but with far fewer decorations and far fewer grave goods. So scholars deduced that the Sungir mammoth hunters probably lived in a hierarchical society with a big chief, and that the dead man was probably the leader not only of one band, but of an entire tribe comprising several different bands. Because it is unlikely that a few dozen members of a single band could have produced so many grave goods by themselves. Archaeologists then discovered an even more interesting tomb at this place at Sungir. The other tomb that they found later on contained two skeletons buried head to head, one near against the other. One skeleton belonged to a boy of the age of around 12 or 13, and the other skeleton belonged to a girl of about 9 or 10 years old. And the girl apparently suffered from some kind of severe deformity in their hip, and maybe had difficulty walking. The boy was covered with about 5,000 ivory beads of the same kind like the chief, and the boy wore on his head a hat. We didn't find the hat, but we found the decoration of the hat. It was again teeth of foxes, about dozens of teeth of foxes, and the boy also was wearing, when they buried him, a belt which was studded with 250 teeth of foxes. At least 60 foxes had to have their teeth pulled out in order to get so many teeth of foxes for the belt of the boy. The girl was covered with equally amazing and rich offerings. She was covered with about 5,250 ivory beads and all kinds of other jewelry and interesting stuff. Both children were also surrounded by ivory statues and by other kinds of delicate and interesting objects. Now, it took a skilled craftsman or craftswoman probably about 45 minutes to prepare each one of the thousands of ivory beads that covered the two children. Fashioning the 10,000 ivory beads that covered the two children, and without counting all the other objects, required about 7,500 hours of delicate work of a very experienced craftsman. This adds up to about 3 years of labor by an experienced artisan just for the ivory beads, without all the other fox teeth and the statues and the other things. It is extremely unlikely that at such a young age the children of Sungir had proved themselves as big chiefs or powerful hunters, and this is why they got all this respect. Only cultural beliefs can explain why they received such an extravagant burial. One option, one theory, is that the children owed their rank to their parents. Perhaps these were the children of the chief, of the leader, in a culture that believed in family charisma and in strict rules of succession. So even though the children themselves did not accomplish anything special during their lives, they were still buried in a magnificent way, with huge investment. According to a second belief, a second theory, the children had been identified at birth as the reincarnation of some long-dead spirit, and this is why they were given so much respect. A third theory that was developed by other scholars argues that the children were buried in such a magnificent way not because of the way of the status they had while alive, but because of the way that they died. These scholars argue that the children were ritually sacrificed, perhaps as part of the burial rites of the leader, and then were buried with all the jewelry and all the magnificent things. And we have examples of such things, of people, ordinary people, being sacrificed during the funeral of a big chief and then buried in huge magnificence. So it might have happened also 30,000 years ago. We don't know for sure what is the correct answer, but whatever it is, the children of Sungir are among the best pieces of evidence we have that 30,000 years ago, sapiens could invent socio-political codes that went far beyond the dictates of our DNA and the behavior patterns of other humans and other animal species. There is nothing like this burial of the children of Sungir among Neanderthals or chimpanzees and elephants. The burial at Sungir is also a very clear indication that at least in some bands there were hierarchies and there was social inequality, a lot of social inequality, already 30,000 years ago. What now about warfare? Was warfare also an ancient institution among sapiens, or is it a relatively new phenomenon? Did ancient forager bands like the Sungir people, did they fight their neighbors or not? As usual, nobody knows for sure. There are different schools of thoughts and many theories. Some scholars imagine that ancient forager societies were kind of peaceful paradise, and they argue that war and violence between people on a large scale began only with the agricultural revolution, when people started to accumulate private property and houses and fields and so forth. Before there was agriculture and there were no villages and cities and granaries and livestock, there was nothing to fight about. So there were no wars before agriculture. This is one theory. Other scholars maintain that the world of the ancient foragers was actually exceptionally cruel and violent, and that warfare and large-scale violence is not the result of agriculture. Both schools of thought, those who think that the ancient foragers were very peaceful, and those who think that the ancient foragers had a lot of wars and conflicts, they have very little evidence to support their arguments. All they have to go by, or we have to go by when we try to understand this question, are some meager archaeological remains and anthropological observations of present-day foragers. Some scholars imagine the ancient forager societies as a kind of peaceful paradises and argue that war and violence began only with the agricultural revolution, when people started to accumulate private property. Before there was agriculture and villages and cities and granaries and livestock and fields and all these things, there was simply nothing much to fight about. So people like the Sungir people, they had little reason to get involved in deadly conflict with their neighbors or within themselves. So this is one way of thinking of it. Other scholars maintain that violence, large-scale violence, began long before the agricultural revolution, that it is somehow embedded in our genes as sapiens, and that the lives of the ancient foragers, like the Sungir people, were exceptionally cruel and brutal and violent already 30,000 and 50,000 years ago. Both schools of thought have very little evidence to support their arguments. All we have to go by when we try to understand the history, the ancient history of warfare, are some meager archaeological remains and anthropological observations of present-day hunter-gatherers. The anthropological evidence is far richer and is very intriguing, but it's very problematic also. Foragers today live mainly in isolated and inhospitable areas such as the Arctic or the Kalahari Desert, where population density is very low and opportunities to find other people are limited. So there are scholars who find that the people in the Kalahari Desert don't fight a lot among themselves, but this is maybe just because they live in the Kalahari Desert and they hardly meet anybody. It doesn't mean that people who lived, say, in the Ganges Valley, in the fertile Ganges Valley 30,000 years ago, did not have wars. And moreover, in recent generations, foragers, even in the Kalahari Desert, are increasingly subject to the authority of modern states. And modern states don't like their subjects fighting with one another, so they prevent the eruption of large-scale conflict. So if we don't find a lot of large-scale conflict between different bands in the Kalahari, maybe this is just the effect of efficient modern countries preventing it, and it doesn't tell us much about conditions before the agricultural revolution. Anthropologists actually had only two main opportunities to observe large and relatively dense population of foragers who were independent of the control of modern states. One time was in northwestern North America, in the northwestern part of the United States, western Canada and Alaska in the 19th century. And the second time was in North Australia during the 19th and early 20th century. These were the two occasions when anthropologists had the opportunity to see in a relatively fertile area how a lot of hunter-gatherers, how a lot of hunter-gatherer bands interact between them. And in both cases, anthropologists have found that there was a relatively high frequency of armed conflict between the different bands. So this supports the idea that warfare has been common among humans and among sapiens long before agriculture. However, it's not a conclusive evidence, because we can't be sure that what is true of people in Western Canada in the 19th century was also true 40,000 years ago for people in Indonesia or in China. The archaeological finding is more important because it gives us a picture of how things were back then and not how they are today. Unfortunately, the archaeological evidence is meager and ambivalent. First of all, it should be stressed that we have absolutely no clear evidence for violence, large-scale violence between humans from more than about 20,000 years ago. Say from the period of the Sungir people, 30,000 years ago, there is no clear evidence for large-scale violence, but it doesn't mean that there was no large-scale violence, because we have very little evidence of anything from that time. From the period after 20,000 years ago, and until the outbreak of the agricultural revolution, there is still there 10,000 years of hunter-gatherer life from which we have much more evidence. But the evidence from this period, between 20,000 years ago and the beginning of the agricultural revolution, around 10,000 years ago, the evidence from that period can go both ways. We have evidence for different patterns. For example, one famous study was a survey that scientists made of 400 skeletons found in Portugal that belonged to the period immediately before the agricultural revolution. They collected all kinds of specimens and evidence about that period. They found 400 different skeletons from that period, and only 2 of these 400 skeletons showed clear marks of human violence, like an arrowhead embedded in a human bone, which is clear evidence of human violence. A similar survey of 400 skeletons from the period immediately before the agricultural revolution in Israel discovered only a single crack in a single skull that could be attributed to human violence. That's all. But it doesn't mean that the other people did not die from violence. It just means that we didn't find hard evidence. You can slit somebody's throat and he will die from it without leaving any obvious marks for future archaeologists on his or her body. A third survey, again of 400 skeletons from pre-agricultural sites was made of the Danube Valley, the valley of the Danube River in Central Europe, and there scientists found evidence, clear evidence for violence on 18 skeletons out of 400. 18 out of 400 may not sound like a lot, but it's actually a very, very high percentage. If all these 18 people really died violently at human hands, it means that about 4.5% of death in the ancient Danube Valley was caused by human violence. Today, the global average is only 1.5%. If you take all wars and all crime today in the world in the early 21st century together, then you find that just 1.5% of the death is caused by them. During the 20th century, which was much more violent, with all the genocide and world wars and so forth, we have evidence for just 5% of death being the result of human violence. So if in the ancient Danube Valley 4.5% of people died violently, this means that the ancient Danube Valley was as violent as the 20th century. The rather depressing findings from the Danube Valley are supported by a string of equally depressing findings from other areas. For example, at Jabal Sakhaba, a site in Sudan, archaeologists have found a cemetery from 12,000 years ago, just before the agricultural revolution, containing 59 skeletons. Now, in some of these skeletons, they found arrowheads and spear points which are still embedded either in the skeleton itself or near it. 24 out of these 59 skeletons had such arrowheads or spear points stuck in them. That's 40% of the people who were buried in this cemetery were probably killed violently by other sapiens, not by elephants or lions, because lions don't shoot arrows, only sapiens do. The skeleton of one woman found in that cemetery revealed 12 different injuries. So somebody must have really hated her or tried to kill her and succeeded. In another place, in the Offnet cave in Bavaria, archaeologists discovered the remains of 38 people, 38 foragers, mainly women and children, who were all thrown together into 2 burial pits. Half the skeletons, including those of children and even babies, bore clear signs of human weapons such as knives and clubs. The few skeletons which belonged to older males bore the worst marks of violence on them. So, in all probability, this burial site from Bavaria, from the Ofnet cave, shows an occasion in which an entire forager band was massacred at one time. The men may have tried to defend it but failed, and then everybody was massacred by some enemies and thrown into these burial pits, and after thousands of years we have found them. So we have all kinds of evidence from that period. And the question is, which evidence is more important or representative? Is it, say, the peaceful skeletons from Israel and Portugal, which have hardly any marks of violence on them? Or is the evidence for the massacres in Jabal Sahaba and Ofnet more representative of the world of the foragers? The answer is that neither is more representative. Just as foragers exhibited a very wide spectrum of religions and social structures, so too they probably had a variety of violence rates. While some areas in some periods, like Portugal or Israel, may have enjoyed peace and tranquility, others might have been torn by ferocious conflicts like Bavaria or the Sudan. So we don't really know much about the lives of the ancient foragers. We would like to know a lot, not only in order to understand their world, but also in order to understand our world, our psychology, our minds. But because of the lack of evidence, it's very difficult to reconstruct even the general patterns of their lives, like whether they had wars or not, whether they had nuclear families or not. It is even more difficult to try and reconstruct particular events. For example, the events of one war or the events of one religious movement. Nevertheless, it is vital to realize that people who lived 20 or 30,000 years ago may have had very rich, exciting, and troublesome lives, just like people today. The world was as colorful, as dramatic, as exciting as it is today, full of various events which we know almost nothing, we can know almost nothing about today. It is vital to realize that they had their own revolutions, ecstatic religious movements, profound philosophical theories, and artistic masterpieces, even if we didn't find the remains. And it is important to keep asking these questions about the lives and world of the ancient foragers, even if we don't have many answers, and even if we will never have all the answers. It's important to ask the questions first of all, because by asking the questions, we are inspiring ourselves to try and look more carefully for evidence. And all the time, scholars develop new kinds of research methods and come up with new kinds of evidence. For example, in the recent 10-15 years, there's been a great revolution in the study of ancient foragers with the help of genetic evidence. 30 years ago or 40 years ago, nobody used it because there was not the necessary technology. But today, we begin to be able to extract DNA from ancient fossilized bones. And from this evidence, we gain all kinds of new insights about the world of the ancient foragers. For instance, let's take the question of whether they lived in nuclear families and whether they were monogamous or they lived in communes and practiced multiple common fatherhood. So how to answer this question? Previously, it was thought that we will never be able to have the answer, at least until we develop time-traveling machines and can go back and look for ourselves. But today, it seems that we might have pretty good answers in the next few years with the help of genetics. For example, you can go to the burial site at Sungir and extract DNA from all the people buried there. And you can go to Jabal Sakhaba in Sudan and to Ofnet Cave in Bavaria and extract DNA from the remains of the people there. And then with the DNA, you can start reconstructing the family trees of those people who probably belonged to the same band. And you can see, for example, whether people with the same mother also had the same father or not. And this is a good way of solving a riddle about the lives of the ancient foragers that until the big breaks of modern genetics seemed to be something we can never solve. Another reason why it is important to keep asking questions, even if there are no clear answers, is in order to remind ourselves of our ignorance. Science is built not only on knowledge, it is also built on ignorance. It's very, very important always to remember what we don't know. And we must remind ourselves how very little we actually know about the history of our species of Homo sapiens. History has been going on for 70,000 years since the cognitive revolution. And about the first 60,000 years of history, we know very, very little. It's like a person who thinks he knows who he is, who thinks he knows himself or herself, and he's, say, 30 years old. And the only thing he remembers and knows are the last 5 years of his life. He remembers nothing. He knows nothing about his childhood, and he thinks he knows himself. So this is us, sapiens. We think we understand who we are. We think we understand human nature and so forth, but we know close to nothing about 60,000 years of our 70,000 years history. And these 60,000 years were extremely important because during that time, the foragers shaped, to a very large extent, not only the bodies and minds which we still carry today, but also they shaped the world around us. There is hardly a place in the world, except perhaps Antarctica, which was not reshaped by the ancient foragers long before the agricultural revolution. When today we go to visit places like the Siberian tundra, or the deserts of Central Australia, or the rainforests of the Amazon, we often imagine to ourselves that we enter a pristine landscape virtually untouched by human hands. But that's an illusion. The foragers were there before us in all these places, and they brought about dramatic changes in the ecology, even of the most dense jungle and even of the most remote and desolate desert. The next lesson will explain how our forager ancestors completely changed the ecology of planet Earth long before the first agricultural village was built. These wandering bands of storytelling sapiens turned out to be not only the most important, but also the most destructive force that the animal kingdom had ever produced. What this destructive force did will be the subject of the next lesson.